All right, at 6 o'clock, we will go ahead and start our webinar. I want to start by welcoming everyone to the Dayton VA Medical Center's Learning About the PACT ACT webinar. We're thrilled to be here with you this evening. I want to start by saying this event is being recorded, so if there's something you missed or later want to rewatch, you'll be able to do that. We'll be sending you a link to the recording after this event. You can also share that link with anyone you feel may benefit from this information that we're sharing here tonight. I'm Scott Leese with the Community Outreach Office at the Medical Center. I'm an Air Force veteran, and like many of you, once had many questions about VA healthcare. Let's see if we can answer your questions this evening about PACT Act benefits and healthcare through the VA. Please realize that as a participant in this session, your microphone has been muted to minimize distracting background noises, kind of like the clock you might have just heard chiming. We have quite a number of folks here participating in this webinar, so this is why we are keeping everyone muted. Again, it's simply to ensure there isn't an excess and distractive noises. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. If you have a question or a concern and you want to share it, you can do so with any of the panelists anytime through the chat pane. You should be able to find that pane at the bottom right of your screen. Simply type in your question and one of the presenters will get to you as soon as they can. For the sake of time, if we don't get to your question during this presentation, not to worry. You can reach us by phone or email, and we'll provide that contact information at the end of this presentation. We're here tonight to talk about some very exciting news. 6 months ago, President Biden signed into law the PACT Act, which is expanding healthcare to more than 6 million veterans, many of whom were not able to receive care through the VA before. The PACT Act is perhaps the largest healthcare and benefit expansion in VA history. The full name of this law is the Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson Honoring Our Promise to Address Comprehensive Toxins, or PACT Act. This is expanding and extending eligibility for VA healthcare for veterans with toxic exposures and veterans of the Vietnam, Gulf War, and post 9/11 eras. It adds more than 20 new presumptive conditions for burn pits and other toxic exposures. It adds more presumptive exposure locations for Agent Orange and radiation, requires VA to provide a toxic exposure screening to every veteran enrolled in VA healthcare, and helps us improve research, staff education, and treatment related to toxic exposures. For those who are already enrolled in VHA healthcare, this legislation affords many the opportunity to acquire or increase their disability rating based on presumptive conditions associated with military service during a wide range of military conflicts and theaters of operation identified in the PACT Act. And that's why we're here to talk about, tonight, how the PACT Act might increase your access to VA healthcare and benefits. We're going to share a short video that highlights what the PACT Act is all about. So sit back and enjoy this brief video.
The PACT Act is a new law that went into effect in August of 2022. This law expands VA healthcare and benefits for veterans who were exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic substances. The PACT Act is one of the largest expansions in healthcare and benefits in VA history. It will help generations of veterans and their survivors get the care and benefits they have earned and deserve. The following is a brief summary of the PACT Act and what it can mean for you and other veterans. The PACT Act expands eligibility for VA healthcare for veterans with toxic exposures and for veterans of the Vietnam, Gulf War, and post 9/11 eras. The PACT Act adds more than 20 new presumptive conditions for burn pits and exposure to other toxic substances. There are also more presumptive exposure locations for Agent Orange and radiation. Toxic exposure refers to a military environmental exposure, such as certain chemicals, air pollutants, radiation, and warfare agents. So, what does a presumptive condition for toxic exposure mean? It has to do with VA disability ratings. VA disability ratings require a disability to be connected to your military service. For some conditions, you may have to prove that your disability is connected to your service. But for other conditions, VA assumes that your service caused your condition. These conditions are called presumptive conditions, and the PACT Act has expanded the number of these types of conditions and exposure locations. If you haven't filed a claim yet, you can learn about your options to file online, in person, or by mail. Visit this website to learn more. If your disability claim was denied in the past, but VA now considers your condition to be presumptive, you can submit a supplemental claim at this website. You can also help spread the word about expanded VA healthcare eligibility. If you know veterans of Vietnam, Gulf War, and post-9/11 eras who aren't enrolled in VA healthcare, reach out to them. They may be hesitant to apply, so try sharing your own experiences with them to help demystify the process. Tell them that VA healthcare for any illness determined to be related to their military service is free. And be sure to remind them that they have earned the right to this care through their service. Point them in the direction of resources to help them apply. Tell them to go online at www.va.gov/health-care. They can also call the toll-free number at 877-222-8387, or they can apply in person at the nearest VA medical center or clinic. The PACT Act has a special healthcare enrollment period from October 1st, 2022 to October 1st, 2023. To learn more about the PACT Act and what it means for your care and other veterans, visit www.va.gov/PACT. Copyright 2022, United States Department of Veterans Affairs. All rights reserved.
So what we're going to do now is have a live presentation. We have several folks with us here this evening, some experts to answer your questions that you might have. Mark Rohner, our PACT Act Program Manager for the Dayton VA, is with us here this evening. Also, Chris Cox from Enrollment and Eligibility for the Dayton VA, and Larry Zietlow from the Veterans Benefit Administration in Cleveland. Again, I am your host, Scott Leese, with the Medical Center's Community Outreach Office. I am an Air Force veteran and will help answer any questions you might have about the Dayton VA Medical Center in general. Now, before we begin with questions, Mark is going to give a brief presentation that goes into far more detail about the PACT Act. Take it away, Mark.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you all here. Let me know as soon as you can see the screen.
We've got it, Mark.
Okay. All right, so as Scott mentioned, we're here to discuss and talk about the PACT Act. And this is a brief overview, and then we'll go into detail during the question and answer. As Scott mentioned, it's Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson's promise to address Comprehensive Toxins Act of 2022. It's called the PACT Act, but its basic bread and butter is it expands and extends eligibility to veterans as well as benefits to veterans. A couple key components to it. It expands the eligibility for VHA healthcare. It helps fast track decision making process when it comes to medical conditions and service connection through the increase of presumptive conditions. Every veteran is now receiving an initial toxic screening when attending a medical appointment at a VA. We've increased our toxic exposure related education. There's additional funding and research studies, and that's part of the registries that I'll go into later. And then this is just building a stronger, better workforce with the PACT Act for the VA to recruit additional employees, top-notch employees, things like that within the healthcare field. And they're also looking to have the VA authorize and expand more VA medical centers. Now, here locally to our area, it's not as much of an issue, but some of the more rural areas throughout the country, this is going to be a tremendous impact for those veterans. Okay, the bulk of this is really targeting a lot of the Gulf War and 9/11 veterans. So for Gulf War and 9/11, a big thing it expands was some of the different conditions, or not conditions, but locations as it relates to Gulf War related illness and various presumptive conditions. It added some additional countries, and you can see throughout here, and these slides will be here. I'm kind of going fast, but that's because we want to get into the bread and butter of the question and answers. But it expands some of the locations. Jordan was a big one that I'm hearing a lot of people, and Egypt, that affected quite a few veterans to our local area, those countries being added. For radiation, they increased and added additional radiation exposure locations. The Thule Air Force Base in Greenland, Palomares in Spain, and Enoatak Atoll in the ocean. For a lot of the Vietnam era veterans, a big thing with the PACT Act, it expanded hypertension as a presumptive condition, as well as the skin condition monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance right here. But more than anything, it expanded locations for the veterans. Veterans serving in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Guam, the Johnson Atoll, those all are now eligible if you're within these various date ranges for conceded Agent Orange exposure and presumptive conditions, service-connected conditions, and other benefits. So it's not just had you served in the Republic of Vietnam. And here's kind of a listing of the basic of the presumed conditions. A lot of these are mainly geared towards different respiratory conditions. They've added a great deal, 23 different types of cancers were added. Here's just an overview of the listing. And with the VHA toxic exposure screening that Scott and I mentioned, what it is who all the veterans enrolled at a VA. It's quick 5-10 minute question during a medical exam. It's going to be done every 5 years at all medical centers, and it's to help support the long-term plan and also figure out what the concerns are of the veterans with their exposures. What those concerns are, where do we need to put resources in studying, things like that. That's part of the reason for this. Here you have the different registries and exposures. There's 6 congressionally created registries. Your Agent Orange, Airborne Hazards Open Burn Pit, Depleted Uranium, Gulf War, Ionized Radiation, the Toxic Embedded Fragments. And then you also have various garrison exposures. Probably the 2 biggest ones for garrison exposures is Camp Lejeune as well as asbestos exposure. Those are 2 of the most common ones. And this just roughly kind of some date ranges of the type of veterans that fall into that categories. The PACT Act also expanded the way for veterans to be able to file and receive benefits. We have a VBA representative as part of our panelist. He'll be able to go in detail as we have some of those questions coming up. One thing to note with the supplemental claims, if you had a claim that was previously denied but is now considered a presumptive condition, at this time, the VA is not going backwards in reopening those. You are encouraged to want to file, and that would be a supplemental claim, but file for that previously denied condition. It also expands to help with the addition of these various presumptive conditions and things. There's a lot more for survivor benefits. So anyone on this line, if your spouse had passed away from a possible condition, or you know someone, a fellow veteran that passed away of a condition that's now a presumptive and they have dependents, you would want to encourage them to speak to someone about filing for possible benefits if they're eligible. When and how should you? So again, this goes back to previously denied claims are not going to be looked at, but there's also information, and this slide doesn't show it very well. One of the other slides, you can see this a lot better, but you can go to va.gov/PACT and get a lot more information from there. And here is the different things. If you have a question about the PACT Act program, how it relates to you, or possibly anything related to toxic exposures, I would encourage you to contact these two numbers up here. If you have a question about your eligibility and enrollment, whether or not you are now eligible for VHA healthcare, we would encourage you to contact the Eligibility and Enrollment Office. For filing a claim or getting more information on how to file a claim, again, here's at va.gov/PACT to get information, or you can also go to your local veteran service officer. There's several organizations like at the Dayton VA, as well as every county in the state of Ohio has a Veteran Services Commission. Any one of them would be more than happy to help you. And if you have any questions specific to the registries, you can click on this website here, and this has a wealth of knowledge about the different registries, the exposures, what the criteria isn't, the dates for eligibility. And then from there, it gives the number for the local area. It should be known because the Airborne Hazards Open Burn Pit is also currently the only registry where you also have to do a step 1 online portion of setting up an account, a mini profile, and that can be found here in this website as well with the links. And that really concludes. I know I went rather fast through this, but that's where we've just found you can go back, look through this information at a later date at your pace to read it, and then we'll get into the question and answer session of this webinar.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Thank you so much for that presentation. We will be sharing that information again through the recording of the webinar, and we could probably actually attach the slides as well, but we'll also actually be providing more information for contacting the Dayton VA, the VBA, et cetera, and so forth later on in the presentation. Right now, let's take some time to answer questions we've already received through the chat pane. We've received a few already. Please remember, if you have a question, feel free to ask it by typing it into the chat pane. We'd love to hear from you. We'll get to it as soon as we can within the time remaining. If we don't get to your question, please know we still want to answer it. We will give you a way to contact us at the end of the presentation. Also, if you don't feel you want to share the information with the audience here, or in the recording, that's fine too. You can go ahead and contact us. We'll give you that contact information later on and ask your question personally. So we'll go right into the questions that we have. So first up, we've heard from Betty. Betty is asking, I received a letter in the mail saying saying I may qualify for benefits through the PACT Act. How do I know if I qualify? So, Mark, do you want to answer that question?
I can take that question,
Larry? Great.
Scott. The best way to know if you qualify is to actually file the claim for disability. In my line of work, I talked to a lot of people who said, I talked to my friend, I talked to somebody at the VFW Lodge, I talked to this person at the medical center, and everyone is giving their opinion. If you'll please just go ahead and file the claim for disability benefits. Let us develop or to say gather all of the information that we can in order to help you make sure that claim is complete, and then we can make a decision on the claim. You can do that either by contacting the VSOs at the Dayton VA Medical Center. You can contact your local county veteran service officer, and Mark has outlined a number of ways that you can make the claim online. But there's really no good way to ask the question on the phone and know for sure if you're going to qualify. Please file the claim.
Yeah, and I would actually add to that also that as Mark had pointed out before, and we said before, the website to do that is .va.gov/pact. And it's not just a place where you can file the claim, it's where you need to go to file the claim, but it also has a wealth of information. It's going to go through all the presumptive conditions and theaters operations and timeframes for those theaters that would help you do a first assessment to find out whether or not you think you might be eligible. But we still encourage everyone to file that claim. If you have any suspect presumptive conditions, especially that you think you might qualify for care or benefits through the PACT Act. So again, go to www.va.gov/pact. Next up, we have Joe. Joe asks, how does a veteran get enrolled into the VA? And I would assume that's really the VHA, the Veteran Health Care. So Chris, you want to answer that?
Yes, Scott, I can answer that one. Hi, Joe. Great question. So a veteran can either apply, they can apply online. I'll actually put up the link over here in the chat here here shortly. Or they can come to the nearest VA medical center or to their CBOC that's close to them and complete a VA form 1010-EZ, and then bring a form of ID, and then they can bring their DD-214 as well, and then they can go to the eligibility enrollment office and set that up.
Chris, would it be good for them to call in advance, which we have a number we can give here at the end of the presentation, but so they can set up an appointment and know what paperwork they need to bring with them?
So they can absolutely call our extension. We do walk-ins as well. They don't have to schedule an appointment. Our office is open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. But our extension is the 5336 with the phone number 937-268-6511.
All right, terrific. Sue wants to know, can a non-enrolled veteran just pay out of pocket for screening? And I'm going to say, Larry, would you want to answer that?
Well, I believe what you're talking about would be the screening, the healthcare screening for the toxic exposure screening. I think Mark and your gang might be better able to answer that question. There are no costs related to filing claims for disability with VBA.
Yeah, with out-of-pocket expenses for a screening, for a non-enrolled veteran, the answer is going to be no. There is no out-of-pocket expense for the screening. However, the screening is currently only open to enrolled veterans. You don't have to have a primary care provider necessarily, but it is currently only for currently enrolled veterans at this time. But that's where meeting with Chris and his staff to see if you can meet the criteria for eligibility and enrollment. Now, that said, also, if depending on the situation for that veteran and their screening and their concern of exposure, if they meet one of the criteria for the 6 known congressionally made registries, they are then eligible to have a registry health assessment done, which is far more detailed than the toxic screening, and that you do not have to be enrolled in VA healthcare. You do not have to have VBA benefits if you meet that criteria for that particular registry. And we go far more in detail. It's more in-depth assessment with a healthcare provider, and then they can give you information about, some of the avenues to seek out additional benefits at that time. And that's where a lot of people for non-enrolled with their exposures, there's a good chance they are going to qualify for some other avenue.
But if they want a screening and they go to the website and file a claim, the VBA will then determine whether or not a screening needs to be done to validate the claim. Correct, Larry?
So there's a couple of ways to look at the screening. As Mark mentioned, you can apply directly to VA to be screened into the various registries. If you file a claim for disability benefits with the Veterans Benefits Administration, we will review your record and we will set up an examination for the toxic screening to go, or for the screenings to go along with whatever disabilities that you claim. So if you claim something that's under the PACT Act, if you claim your right knee or your left knee, which you can do along with your PACT Act claim, if you make a claim for any disability at all, we have to determine whether or not that disability existed during your military service. If there's evidence of that in your service treatment records, well, then we're going to order an examination. The difference between the PACT Act and an ordinary claim is if you're making a claim for exposures under the PACT Act and you have one of the disabilities listed that we've seen before, we don't have to make a determination whether or not it existed in the military. We presume that the disability existed in the military, which is where we get the concept of a presumptive condition. So if your condition is listed on the presumptive list, you make an application for VA benefits, we'll do an examination so that we can determine the degree of disability. If you apply for something that is not on that presumptive list, we'll do a review, we'll determine whether or not the disability incurred in or was aggravated by military service, and if it was, then we will do the similar exam to determine the degree of disability. That's the advantage of a presumptive condition. You don't have to prove that you had it in the military or that you were exposed to anything.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but these, going back to the original question from Sue, do we pay out of pocket? No, there is no out-of-pocket expense, correct?
There are no out-of-pocket expenses. There are no expenses at all for the veteran who files a claim for disability. Everything is handled by the VBA. We will establish the request for the examinations. We will request any medical records you tell us that need to be gathered, and we will obtain your service treatment records. We will obtain your military personnel records. There's no need for you to try to gather all of those records before you file a claim. We'll do it for you. And after that, if you want copies of those records or you want to see the records we used, you are entitled to receive them from VBA.
And the travel is also paid, correct? If I'm not mistaken, that if you have to travel a certain distance for those screenings, even that is paid for.
The medical center will pay for the examinations. There are some, and that's paid for based on distance. There are some issues sometimes in getting a veteran to an examination. We don't do all of the exams at the VA Medical Center. Many of our exams are done by contract examiners. We try to find people that are close to the area where the veteran lives. Sometimes we can do that and sometimes we can't. But wherever we do have to send a veteran for an exam, we're going to pay the mileage cost for the veteran of the round trip fare.
Terrific answer. Thank you. So Robert says, I'm already service connected for the Gulf War. Why should I join a registry? And I think that's a great question.
Yeah, there is. I'll take that. There definitely is a difference between being service connected through Veteran Benefits Administration for a medical condition as a result of your time in service and being on a formal and participating in a registry. The registries are done through Veterans Health Administration, the healthcare entity of the VA, the medical centers, the hospitals, community CBOCs. So the registries are twofold, two purposes. The one is to inform you, the veteran, of the various known medical conditions that we know, depending on the registry that you're qualified for or participating in, these are the health conditions that we know of that people are exposed to. They can educate you on what those signs and symptoms are so that you're a more knowledgeable veteran patient on your own health care. And so that way, if you have one of those conditions, and hopefully you don't and never do, but if you do, or if you later develop one of them or the signs or symptoms, you're more knowledgeable on it. You would know, think about possibly filing for benefits, but also you can relay this to your VA provider as well. Or if you go to the civilian world, hey doc, I'm starting to develop this and this. I remember a couple years ago when I was on a registry at the VA, they said this might have been related to this type of exposure. The second part is helping the VA collect data. And that data, this is where some of those, the VA decides for presumptive conditions. We're seeing a large majority of veterans at this location, this type of exposure are coming down with these type of health conditions. This helps with those presumptive conditions is data gathering. And also in addition to that data gathering, it lets the VA know what areas they would like to possibly or should think about placing research, money for funding for the research. Depending on your particular circumstances, you could also be eligible for certain medical studies on a purely volunteer basis if that's something you would want. There's a couple places that handle medical research, again, volunteer, but it's mainly twofold: educate you about your health and health conditions you need to be aware of should they ever arise or should you have them, but also to help the VA collect that data. Right now, 80% of people that were at this base do not have this condition, but then 5 years later, they are developing this condition. That helps them track that.
All right, terrific, Mark. Thank you. Next up, we have a question from Mike. He says he was a submarine veteran from 86 to 97, had major asbestos exposure underway due to a situation, plus ionization or ionizing radiation due to a rating being a nuclear operator. Would the PACT Act apply to his or other veterans' situations that are similar to this?
Do you want me to take that or are you, Larry?
Sure, Mark. That'd be great.
Okay. So with like the possible asbestos exposure or the concern of the exposure of asbestos, certainly we would encourage him to want to file for that condition. But also realize when it comes to exposures, it's not so much you have exposure. Do you have a health condition as a result of that exposure? Just because you were around asbestos does not mean you are going to contract mesothelioma, asbestosis, things like that. It doesn't mean you have it. You need to actually have the health condition to file for it. Now, certainly, and with the PACT Act, they added all those different presumptives, and a lot of them are cancers. That's a lot of this stuff does cause cancers, the exposure. So that definitely does affect, and the PACT Act did involve them.
All right.
So in addition to that, as we're speaking of disabilities that may not necessarily fall under the PACT Act, as Mark mentioned, the mesothelioma is not specifically listed. Ionizing radiation, there are various forms of ionizing radiation exposure that are considered presumptive conditions, not under the PACT Act, but under other areas of the law where these things can be considered presumptive. It's important to understand. Now, you mentioned that you were a nuclear submariner. There are documentation that came within your medical record that speaks to the amount of nuclear radiation you had over the course of the time that you were in the military. That documentation would be in your service medical record, and you should have a copy of that as well. I guess I'm tipping my hand. I was also a nuclear submariner when I was in the military. So the things that you describe, exposure to asbestos, reactor operation, if you were back in the engineering department doing those things, it is possible that you would be eligible for compensation, not under the PACT Act, but just as a general rule, as a claim for disability. You should go on to the internet and do a search for ionizing radiation or VA compensation. And you'll see all the types of cancers that Mark was talking about that are directly related to your exposure to ionizing radiation. For asbestos, as Mark mentions, you need a diagnosis of asbestosis, because it's not just a question of were you exposed, but do you have a medical condition that's related to that exposure? Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Jack asks, how can I tell if I'm on the Agent Orange registry?
Okay, if you are unsure if you're on the registry, I would just encourage you to contact, well, all of you should be part of the Dayton VA Medical Center. You want to contact our registry department at the Dayton VA's phone number, which is 937-268-6511, and then extension 3259. We'll look you up, take a look, see if you're on the registry. If you're not on the registry, and we're going to go ahead, and you're currently enrolled, we're going to go ahead and get you scheduled for an assessment if that's what you want. If you are on the registry, depending on when you got on the registry and if you've had any major health changes, we may go ahead and we'll have that discussion with you at that time. May go ahead and schedule you to do a reassessment so that way the registry has the most up-to-date medical information. And I do get quite often veterans confusing the difference, again, between being service connected for a condition such as Agent Orange. You are not actually service connected for Agent Orange. You are service connected for a particular health condition that's usually a presumptive as a result of your Agent Orange exposure. And that is and can be completely different than being on the Agent Orange registry. Just like if you do get a registry exam, that does not in any way create, start, solicit an actual claim for VBA service-connected benefits either. You still have to file a claim. Again, they are two separate programs, but a lot of times they work off each other, but they are separate, and they do cause some confusion in that regards.
All right, thank you, Mark. Next up, Tim says he was denied by VA for his claim for hypertension, but it is in the PACT Act now. Will VA go ahead and grant my claim?
VA is not going to go back and grant your claim unless you file again for that disability. So you'll file, you've already been denied once. You'll use VA form 20-0995. You'll use that as a supplemental claim. You'll file a claim for hypertension. You can write hypertension based on the PACT Act. And we will then review the claim and review the disability records for their hypertension. We may send you for an examination unless we can pull up from the medical records what the blood pressure readings that have been taken in the recent past have been. We'll look at those readings, we'll look at your medical record, and we will then make a determination to grant the presumptive disability. It's important to note, though, that the effective date of the law is August 10th, 2022. The effective date of your grant of hypertension, even though you asked for it a long time ago and it was denied, you were clearly exposed to Agent Orange in Vietnam, and it clearly is eligible under the PACT Act. Disabilities that are eligible for service connection under the PACT Act have an effective date of the date of the law, and the date of the law is August 10th, 2022. So when you get your rating back that says, yes, you're service connected for hypertension, you'll find it will have an effective date of August 10th of 2022, as opposed to when you were initially diagnosed with hypertension or when you initially were in Vietnam.
All right, great answer, Larry. Thanks. Next up, Tim says, I'm sorry, we already did that one. Next up is Brandon, and Brandon says, my cousin deployed to Kosovo. He was in the National Guard and deployed for 6 months. Is he eligible for VA care?
Hey Scott, I'll take that one since it's eligibility. The best situation that we can state for anyone who's has a question on if they're eligible or not is to come by our office. Like we stated before, we're open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Bring your 1010, come in, bring your DD214, and then also we fill out a 1010 easy, and then we can take a look at everything for you and find out if you're eligible or not.
All right, super. Mary heard there were dates when the benefits and enrollment would begin, and I think, Larry, you talked a little bit about that.
I did. There is some confusion when people look at the PACT Act as it was presented back in August, and as the various media outlets spoke about the PACT Act over the course of 2022. And if you look at the original documentation on the PACT Act and all of the bills and proposals, there were different dates established for some of the disabilities that are listed in the PACT Act. Certain disabilities were due to start and be effective much later than the date of the filing of the claim. And these dates were all, they were kind of all over the map. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs made the determination when the PACT Act was signed that all disabilities covered under the PACT Act, regardless of what the original documentation said, would have an effective date of the date of the signing of the law, August 10th of 2022. So please don't hesitate. Don't wait to file your claim for that future date down the road that you saw in some of those earlier published documents. File your claim now. All the disability conditions that are listed in the PACT Act are effective August 10th, 2022.
All right, super. I've actually have one question left, so we've got plenty of time left. So if there's anyone that wants to ask a question, again, I'm going to encourage everyone to think about putting their questions in the Q&A section there. We'll be glad to answer any questions you have. But again, if there's something you want to talk about to somebody personally, don't want to share with the group, we'll be glad to share contact information with you here shortly, and you can reach out to us at a later date. Brad says he was at Camp Pendleton and they burned everything. Can I sign up for the burn pit registry?
Okay, I'll go ahead and take that. Quick answer, no. The Airborne Hazards Open Burn Pit Registry has specific parameters, and it is towards veterans that served in Southwest Asia Theater of Operations during a time frame. A rough ballpark is basically after 1990 all the way up to today. That's a rough, but Southwest Theater of Operations. Now, that does not mean you weren't exposed to different chemicals, toxins, things like that that were being burned. Now, what would happen if you're enrolled at the Dayton VA, when you have your toxic exposure screening and you endorse exposures, to burn pits and toxins as a result of that, and you have concerns about that, you would be referred to our environmental registry or environmental toxic exposure department. You don't qualify for an actual registry, but we still do a more detailed health assessment as a non-registry. And also from a VBA service connected standpoint, if you have certain conditions based on that question, being at Camp Pendleton and exposed to burn pits, you're going to be exposed to possibly some toxins. You're not going to meet the criteria of a presumptive condition, but that doesn't mean you still can't or would be discouraged to file for those medical conditions you may have. It's just now that little bit of burden of proof does fall on you, the veteran, whereas when it's a presumptive condition, if you meet those different time frames and parameters, that burden of proof is not on you. And I'll allow Larry can go a little bit more in detail on the burden of proof and what that kind of means for the veteran.
Yeah, Mark, you did a great job there. So what does it take to become service connected? From outside of the parameter of presumptive conditions, being service connected for a disability requires three things. There must be an incident in the military that happened to you. In this particular case, someone who was involved in burn pits that are not part of the PACT Act. Let's say you were in Vietnam, and we know that the military has been burning things forever. This is nothing new. So maybe you were maybe there were burn pits where you were in Vietnam, but they're not covered under the PACT Act. So in order to determine whether or not that situation existed, we have to verify that the condition existed while you were in the military. Either you were diagnosed with this condition while you were there in the military, or we can find records that prove that something actually happened. The other thing that the other part of the three-part link here is that you must have a current chronic disability. Mark's mentioned that, and we've all mentioned that already. You must have a current disability. There must be something currently related to that. So you have a current disability, you have a disability that happened in the military or a situation that happened in the military, and the third is that there must be a link between what happened in the military and the condition that you have now. In government speak, they like to call that a nexus. So you need a nexus between your military service and the current disability. And if we have all three of those things, then we'll do an examination. And that examination will ask the doctor, is it least as likely as not that the condition that you have now is related to what happened to you back in the military? And if the doctor feels that it is, then that disability can be considered service connected. With presumptive disabilities, we don't need to hear least as likely as not, and we don't need a link or a nexus.
All right, super, Larry. Thank you for that answer. This was really our last question. Unless anybody else has another question, feel free to type it in the Q&A. We'll get to it if you get it here into us real quick. But for now, we hope you have found this event both helpful and informative. We're gonna if we didn't get to your questions, don't worry. Again, you can contact us later on via phone if you want to. You can share with the group, or feel free to contact our PACT ACT program office at 937-268-6511, or and that's extension 5807 or extension 3259. Again, those are extensions 5807 or 3259. To file a claim through VBA through the PACT Act, go to www.va.gov. Again, that's www.va.gov/PACT. As a reminder, filing a claim through the PACT Act does not automatically enroll you in VA healthcare. Claims only determine eligibility for benefits through the PACT Act. You must still apply for healthcare benefits through the Veterans Health Administration, and you can do that at our Enrollment and Eligibility Office. For more information about applying for VH Healthcare, call E&E at their office at 937-267-7608 for questions or how to enroll with the Dayton VA. Again, that number is 937-267-7608. For those who are not currently enrolled with the Dayton VA for their health care, there are several options for enrolling. Again, it's in person at the Dayton VA Medical Center at the Enrollment and Eligibility Desk. Chris is down there and his crew will take care of you. Or you can actually go to our community-based outpatient clinics. We'll give you contact information for them shortly. Again, go to www.choose.va.gov/health, and you can enroll online there, or call the National Health and Eligibility Center at 877-222-8387. And if you want to, if you're tech savvy, go ahead and download that 1010 Easy off online and mail that form into the Dayton VA Medical Center to 4100 West 3rd Street, Dayton, Ohio, 45428. If you're not currently enrolled and want to do it in person, again, you can come to the Dayton Medical Center, or we have community-based outpatient clinics in Lima, Middletown, Richmond, and Springfield, and there's their phone numbers there. You can call them or stop in and ask for information about enrollment. They'll be glad to take care of you at those CBOCs as well. Thanks again to our panelists for all the great information they have shared with us this evening. And thanks again to everyone who attended this event. We had some great questions, and I hope everyone has learned a lot about the PACT Act. Again, we will be sending out this presentation to you via email and all the contact information as well. So feel free to rewatch this information if you want to catch something you might have missed, or just want to get a little more detail, or be sure to share it with fellow veterans and friends that know of veterans that might benefit from learning more about the PACT Act or VHA healthcare benefits. And I hope that you all have had a great evening with us. I know I've had quite an experience learning a little bit more about the PACT Act. Every time we do this, I learn a few more things. So hope you all did too. So right now, just again, want to say thanks again to our panelists, Mark Rohner, Chris Cox, and Larry Zietlow for all the great information they provided. Have a great rest of your evening, and thanks to all our veterans for their service to a grateful nation.
Thank you.